Hey guys, Tom here from Metalloud, and it's time to take a look at the top 10 runners-up from 2015. Now, these are albums that unfortunately didn't make it onto my top 10 list, but they are still memorable in their own right and deserve recognition. As always, these are not ordered in any sort of rank, so number 1 isn't necessarily more memorable than number 10. So let's get right to it. These are the top 10 runners-up for 2015.
Number 10.
So number 10 is Miss May I with Deathless.
Turn back the time.
Now, Miss May I've always kind of been a metalcore band that I've enjoyed. They get a lot of hate within the metalcore scene. I've never really understood why necessarily. Their first two albums brought some kind of like shredding into things and almost thrash metal sound to the metalcore genre, and it kind of spiced things up a little bit. It was something you really didn't hear so much within the metalcore scene. Usually you heard like the same riffs and everyone was trying to be as heavy as each other, but Miss May I kind of took a different approach to things and it really worked. Their last two albums kind of toned that down a little bit and didn't work so much. They kind of felt just generic in a way. They weren't as powerful as their first two albums ended up being. And it really was due to a lack of... It felt like there was almost a lack of passion in there. However, Deathless is a different story. It really goes back to their origins a little bit and their first two albums. Not necessarily in sound or style, but... There's a lot of more shredding in there. It slows things down a little bit for some songs. There's some elements of kind of even progressive metal in there. And, you know, there's still some cheese from their earlier days in there. Some of the lyrics are a bit on the shallow side, especially when they're shouting, "I hate everyone, I hate everything." But overall, it's definitely a markable improvement over their last two albums and even over their first two albums, and it brings back a lot of the style and substance that they kind of started off with.
Number 9.
Number 9 is Grimes with Art Angels. So this is another album that really kind of had to grow on me. I wasn't that impressed the first couple times I listened to it, but it's probably due to unfair expectations from the artist Grimes. Now, her work has always been more experimental pop. I've always felt like it was kind of centered in 80s synth pop with a lot of just being weird for the sake of weird that was kind of presented as being experimental in a way. And Art Angels kind of felt like it was toned down a lot more, that she kind of stripped out a lot of the weird bits to kind of be a more traditional pop sound, and I didn't really like it as much because of that. I felt like she was kind of trying to push it as a traditional pop album, whereas she kind of always was more experimental in a way, and I always felt like that was where her comfort zone was. And unfortunately, I really kind of felt like her album wasn't just trying as much as she had in the past. Now, the more I listen to it, I've realized that those were my kind of unfair expectations of her as an artist and as this album, and I've realized that while this is more accessible as an album, and it definitely does have a lot of traditional pop elements to it, it's still a very kind of out there album and different from what traditional pop artists are doing, especially these days. And while I said that her earlier work was definitely centered kind of in 80s synth pop, this album really feels like it was ripped right out of the 90s in some ways, especially songs like California, where it's kind of that pop blended with some soft rock in there, and that really is kind of something I like a lot. It kind of feels like she's channeling older pop sounds and kind of presenting them in a different way. And while overall this album definitely succeeds, there are a few songs that really kind of don't do too well on there. There's some songs that are just weird for the sake of weird, and not even whole songs, but there's just some certain parts in them that just really kind of just don't work and are going to be off-putting. I'm sure there's some people who like that, who do enjoy just weird out there stuff like random screaming and whatever, but that's unfortunately not something that really appeals to me, and it just kind of feels out of place, especially when I said this is kind of a tone down and a more traditional pop sound versus what we expected from her in the past. However, fortunately, most of the songs, and the reason why this album works, are really kind of a lesson in nostalgic experimentation and what pop can actually sound like when you turn off the radio and when an artist is actually trying.
Number 8.
Number 8 is Stolen Jars with Kept.
You were caught in my head, I was feeling my teeth fall out.
Now, as I mentioned with my review of this album, I discovered Stolen Jars from a show that I went to in New Jersey. They were one of the opening bands, and I'm really kind of glad I did discover them. They're certainly different from what I normally would listen to, as you can tell, Metalloud. My preferred genre is generally hardcore, metalcore, things like that. I do definitely like indie rock and stuff like that, but they're more of a folky indie rock sound. Everything is kind of atmospheric and ethereal and just kind of light-hearted and lightness to it. And it really kind of works. The dynamic between the whole band is definitely one of the best elements of their sound. Everyone kind of works together and complements each other in a way, and it comes out in their music so well. And I definitely would suggest, if you can see them, definitely go see them and support this band. Kept is a very nice album to listen to. Like I said, it's very kind of light, not necessarily upbeat it is, but at the same time it's more just light. It's not going to oppress you. It's not going to leave you feeling kind of like a dark cloud is over your head. It's just a very light and airy album, but not poppy. Like I said, folky. They're kind of a folky style of indie rock, and they just work so well on this album. So like I said, if you do have a chance to check them out, I really do suggest, because chances are this band is going to be going places.
Number 7.
So number 7 is Veil Maya with Matriarch.
This kind was ever doubted us. We're surrounded with the question.
Now, it's always worrisome when a band changes a front-facing part like a vocalist. You really never know what you're going to get and what to expect. And sometimes it's a good thing, sometimes not so good. And thankfully, Veil Maya has never really been a vocal-heavy band. While they do definitely have the vocal work in there, their main strength has been in their intricate guitar work and kind of cut-up song structure, and just overall heaviness that they've kind of honed over the years. They are known as one of the bands that kind of started the gent, whatever you want to call it, genre, and I've kind of never really got that from them. They definitely, bands have kind of stolen elements from Veil Maya, but they've always been more of a technical or kind of progressive metalcore band, deathcore band. That's something that kind of carries over through this album. So while the vocalist definitely has changed and there's a different style to the songs in general, there's still a lot of Veil Maya in here that we're used to. And that's the thing, the new vocalist really kind of brings this huge change in style to the band. It's definitely more accessible, and I bet, there's going to be a lot of fans of Veil Maya are probably going to not enjoy that so much. There's a lot more clean vocals in here, and they actually work well, but again, I could see how if you're used to what Veil Maya was before, it's definitely going to be a little bit off-putting. And you just kind of have to get used to it. I like how it works. It kind of does make them a more accessible band, and that's generally a good thing in most cases. It doesn't feel like anything was worsened because of the change in style. It doesn't feel like they kind of lost anything in their transition. It just feels like they've changed a little bit to kind of grow their audience perhaps, or just experiment a little bit more with different sounds. And throughout all this change, underneath it all, you're still going to hear Veil Maya. Particular with the guitar work and, the opening of the track Ellie, the opening riff off that is straight from any other Veil Maya album. And it's definitely nice to see them not compromise anything in the transition. Now, this album is definitely going to leave some fans behind who are into that cleaner side of things with the vocal work, but overall, this is definitely a new Veil of Maya that is worth a listen.
Number 6.
Number 6 is Northernmost with Pinedale, the EP. Now, it's unfortunate that as of making this video, Northernmost is gearing up for their last show, at least for the foreseeable future. As I mentioned before, I discovered this band on a late night just spree on Kickstarter just to find something kind of cool, and I came across them looking for money to put out their first album, and I definitely supported them with that, and it came out to be just such a fantastic album. And now that they're kind of at the end of the road with things, thankfully this last, bout that they've given us, this last EP called Pinedale, is an excellent genre piece. And there's been this huge new wave of emo music lately, and Northernmost have kind of just really been in the thick of it as one of the better bands, definitely one of the better unknown bands, I would say. And they've kind of really stepped things up with this EP. There's major differences over their last album. I mean, it's not so major that you're not going to recognize the band or that it's a completely different type of music or anything, but it's a more mature album. It's definitely a more methodical album than their previous work. Right away, you get hit with this kind of soft, almost psychedelic opening called Greenbrier, and it starts making you feel things right away. And once those vocals and the lyrics hit, just the floodgates just open up from there. And the dynamic really between Jesse's softer, clean vocals and Scott's harsher voice, they just work so well together, and they complement each other in ways that bands really wish they could. And you know what? I wish these guys the best of luck with whatever they're doing next, but at least they left us with something that is highly enjoyable.
Number 5.
Number 5 is In Writing with While You Were Away.
Closed off and tongue-tied. I never really.
In Writing and their album While You Were Away is another example of this new wave of emo indie rock music, and it's also they're also another band I discovered by going to a show. While You're Away gives you this nice, warm, atmospheric introduction with some sampling, and there's this huge build-up to just where everything kicks in, and it's so cathartic when everything kind of comes together on the opening track, and then it just takes off from there, and everything ranges from, kind of soft and emotional to upbeat and fun. And they really kind of nailed it with this album. And, everything, the choruses are going to have you chanting along. The guitar riffs are going to have you kind of nodding your head a little bit. And, like I said, this is another band that kind of caused me to go outside of my comfort zone with music. And as I mentioned in my original review, they're not really something I normally would pay attention to. But I'm glad I did, and, it just shows that there are these amazing, awesome, partially unknown bands that are making just fantastic music out there. You just got to know where to find them.
Number 4.
Number 4 is Jeff Rosenstock's We Cool.
Phillips living up in Chicago. Maddie's working hard in Ohio. Dixie and Chris are very far away.
Jeff Rosenstock's solo album features some of the most sarcastically self-depreciating pop punk ever put down on an album. This is really kind of an indie rock album for the millennial generation here, which is who I am and who a lot of people who are going to see this and be interested in Jeff Rosenstock are. We're quickly growing up and experience life in this kind of really fast-paced way, and we're all experiencing it in these different ways. And Jeff Rosenstock really kind of nails it on this album, talking about watching your friends all get houses and have kids and get married and doing all these adult things. And some of us are just sitting here on a couch or in a hotel room and just wasting the day away pretty much, and just how that makes you kind of feel that you've accomplished really nothing in comparison. Even if you really have, you just don't see it when you're comparing yourself against everyone else in your life. And it talks about, you know, friends moving away and missing people and things like that. And he just really kind of hits home with this album and does it in such a self-depreciating way that it really is relatable to most people.
Number 3.
Number 3 is Iwrestledabearonce with Hail Mary. Now, Iwrestledabearonce have always been one of my favorite bands. They've managed to take deathcore and metalcore and really just kind of have fun with it. They've thrown in everything to the genres from jazz to surf rock to disco to the kitchen sink even, and it's just been, you know, a lot of fun nonsense, and there's been just so much lightheartedness to it that you really don't see in the genre. Everybody always just takes things way too seriously. And it's nice that a band like Iwrestledabearonce is really kind of having fun with it, but they're also doing it in such a way that, you know, it's great to listen to. It's not just cheesy or, you know, bad music or anything like that. I mean, their guitar work is just fantastic. The drumming's great. Their previous vocalist, Krista Cameron, had just a great range, and Courtney LaPlante, the new vocalist, has even greater range, and she kind of expands herself even more on this album as well. She's doing a hell of a job of taking over, and she now is Iwrestledabearonce. She was from the get-go. There was never this kind of jarring transition that you sometimes get with a change of a vocalist. Now, Hail Mary is the absolute heaviest album that we get from Iwrestledabearonce. I mean, this is just oppressively heavy, and it's the breakdowns and the guitar riffs are really kind of going to get to you and shake you to your core a bit. And unfortunately, that's the only issue I really had with this album, is just how heavy it is, that it just lacks some of the lightheartedness and the whimsicalness of the previous albums, and you don't hear as much experimentation as you kind of did in the past. It just feels like a well done but straightforward deathcore mixed in with some mathcore album, and it's just a little bit on the disappointing side to not hear some of those elements that we got in the past. Now, thankfully, as heavy as this is, there are some softer moments in it right when you're going to be thinking, I really wish that this wasn't so heavy, and you find yourself wishing for some clean vocals. They hit you right with that in just the perfect moment. And even after that, they go right back into the heavy again. So there's some moments of rest, so it never really gets tiresome, but it just keeps berating you with these just heavy riffs and just brutal breakdowns over and over again. And like I said, it's great to hear. It's still a very well done album. I never say that these guys lack any kind of talent or anything like that, but it's just a little bit different from what we've heard from in the past and not as fun. But again, it's still a great album, which is why it's on this list.
Number 2.
Number 2 is Screaming Females with Rose Mountain. Continuing their shredtastic sound with Rose Mountain, Screaming Females prove once again why they're really legends of the indie rock scene. This album ups the bass lines from the previous albums and feels like a very bass-heavy sound, and it's heavier than their previous albums. Marissa Paternoster is really still cranking out those awesome guitar riffs, like on the track Ripe, which is probably one of my favorite tracks off of this album. Really comes off sounding like a late 60s, early 70s kind of rock song like Black Sabbath or Motorhead, and it's really kind of reminiscent of those bands in a indie rock kind of flavor to it. And they really balance these awesome guitar riffs and the shredding with these emotional lyrics as well. And Rose Mountain is just going to be an album that will stick with you throughout. I mean, there's some not so great tracks on here. I mean, there's a few of them kind of fall flat, but none of them get to the point where they're bad or anything like that. Just not as memorable. But I think a lot of it has to do with how memorable the other tracks on this album really are, that they kind of overshadow some of the other stuff. And that a lot of that has to do with Marissa Paternoster's guitar work on this album and just the production in general. So I would say that, Rose Mountain really is a memorable album from this year that is going to stick with you throughout.
Number 1.
Number 1 is Sorority Noises' Joy Departed.
Devil on my shoulder said try this instead, so started using again.
Sorority Noise managed to really capture perfectly how it feels to deal with life and depression when you basically just hate yourself. And they managed to hit all the kind of indie rock emo checkpoints with this album, talking about life and lost loves and even dealing with drug use and things like that. And their songs musically range from the softer tracks like the opening track and the song Fluorescent Black to tracks like Using, which are just these big kind of chanty punk rock songs with these emo lyrics mixed in. And they really kind of hit home a lot of times, like lines like I'm not sure of anything in the world except I'm always wearing black and sleeping in, which is something that probably hits home for a lot of us here. And even so, even as depressing and emotional as an album that this can be, it really is this cathartic album to kind of listen to somebody express exactly how you feel about life and about people and about things that happen to you in these lyrics and present them in this musical way, and these fun kind of punk rock songs and these ballady songs and these just some lighthearted, upbeated songs musically with these kind of really depressing lyrics. And, for that reason, Joy Departed really is one of the best albums and one of the most memorable albums of 2015. So guys, thank you so much for watching. That was my top 10 most memorable albums of 2015. These were all albums that didn't quite make it onto my top 10 list, but I still feel deserve recognition for being memorable albums of the year. So I want to hear from you. What were your guys' top 10 albums of the year and runners-up, things like that? Did you like my list? Do you agree with my choices? Let me know down below in the comments. As always, if you like what you saw, hit that like button. And if you want to see more, subscribe to the channel.